Okay, so you're all very welcome to week 2 of the course, and welcome. I know some of you weren't able to make it last week, so welcome back. Welcome to the course for the first time. So my name is Vajrashura, and I'll give you a sense of what we're going to be doing tonight and what we did last week. So let me just share this. Okay, so what we'll be doing this week is we will begin by looking at, well, it actually we'll do the recap of last week, but before we do the home practice and breakout rooms, we'll do a short body scan as well in there. And tonight we're looking at consumerism. So I think consumerism is a really important area to look at, as you'll see as we explore it tonight, and a real way that the Dharma, well, I think it's the thing that really affects us in our world, and it's also something that the Dharma has that Buddhism practice has quite a strong response to. As part of consumerism, I want to look at the waste economy and how it developed, and I want to look at a Buddhist response to consumerism, and this involves looking at what's called dukkha, which we'll see is, you could say it's unsatisfactoriness, unhappiness, suffering, and we'll look at craving and how that plays a part in consumerism, but what the Buddhist perspective on that is. And we look at living more contentedly, living more generously, and so on, living with a much more positive vision of existence. And then we'll come back and finish again with home practice. And throughout as well, there'll be opportunities for questions. Yep. So what we did last week, most of you were here, but if you weren't here, what we did last week, we looked at the Buddha's life and the Buddha's world. So the Buddha's life and the Buddha's world was very different to our own. And he was someone who gained enlightenment. So we looked a bit at what enlightenment is. And we looked at how the Buddha responded to the world, how he responded to his situation that he was in. And then we looked at our own life and our own world and saw that was very different. We live in a very different world in many ways to what the Buddha experienced. But there are things that we really feel strongly about. There are things that we're passionate about. We explore that a bit. We also looked at working with despair. So often a common response to, our life and our world is a response of despair. But I was trying to reassure that you can't destroy the world. You can't save the world on your own. So the Bodhisattva's response was to build community and work with other people to help build a better world. And we looked at a particular example of a Buddhist response to the world that isn't theoretical, that did actually happen. So that was the example of Dr. Ambedkar, and he talked about liberty, in other words, freedom for ourselves and allowing other people freedom. Equality, seeing that, humanity is basically one, that, other people are as dear to them as we are to ourselves. And then fraternity, which is basically, caring for each other, looking out for each other, compassionate activity, trying to act basically in the world. So that's that was the recap of last week. I'll go on in a moment to what the home practice was, but I think it'd be good first to just do a short body scan. So we'll do a very short meditation body scan just to arrive, and then we'll go into more talking. So we'll go into how we got on during the week, and we'll go into great breakout rooms, and then we'll come back for some more Q&A and some more discussion. But before we do all that, why don't we just fully arrive? So why don't we just set ourselves up that we're sitting upright, that we're sitting comfortably, that we're sitting alert, and at the same time we're relaxed, that we can let go into our posture. Okay, so just setting up my clock. So maybe just settling back into our chair, maybe taking a deeper breath or two. With each deep in-breath, we're drawing up energy from the earth. With each out-breath, we're just letting it go back down into the earth and relaxing down into the support of our chairs or our cushion or whatever we're sitting on. And after 3 or 4 of those breaths, just letting that go again. And maybe then beginning by tuning into sounds we can hear. Just opening to them. The traffic on the road outside. The noise of our computer. The fans. Noises in the house. The sound of my voice. Our stomach gurgling from our dinner. Just being open, allowing sound to come to us. And now opening to the body a bit more, feeling the contact of your body with the floor, with the cushions, with the chair. Broadening out from just those places of contact to include more of the body. Noticing what's vivid in our experience. Noticing where we can't feel much. And then for the last minute or two, just being aware of the breath in the body. Not in the head, but down in the chest, in the stomach, in the abdomen. And when you're ready, starting to broaden out then to take in the sounds we can hear once more. Becoming aware of the room, the house, the area around us. And then starting to reintroduce movement, wiggling fingers and toes, and making whatever stretches, adjustments, movements you want to make to bring the practice to a close. And in your own time, then opening your eyes. Okay, so welcome if you just arrived. So I'm just gonna do a recap of the home practice, and then we'll go into groups for about 10 minutes, in groups of 4 with some groups of 3 probably, and we can talk about how we got on. If you weren't here last week, or you didn't do any of the home practice, you can just talk about whatever you want, obviously related to the course somehow. And so if it's a group of 4, obviously, just keep an eye on the time. There'll be a timer in the top corner. But anyways, before we do that, let's just look at the home practice. So last week we were talking about lots of different things. So I asked you to read the notes, just to, if you missed it, or if you wanted to read further into the details. That was part of the homework. But the main practice, I think, was the next couple of things. So clarify what you feel inspired to help the world. Note what helps and hinders this. So that was in relation to, certain stories you can tell yourself lead to despair. And actually, we are, I think, naturally quite idealistic in a very positive sense. But one of the main things I think I wanted you to do is to keep the notebook and write the gratitude journal, basically. So keep a small notebook, record 3 things you feel grateful for in your day and in your life. And I was recommending that in particular maybe in the evenings to do that before you go to bed. And also you could record one thing you'd like to work on the following day to meet the world's needs. And and then ongoingly, as you do that, you could check in the next day how you got on with that. So did you do any of that for during the week? So you can report in about that, or indeed just how last week's class affected you and anything that came out of it. Okay, so Amy, if you're ready, you can invite people to go to groups. So we'll see you back here in 10 minutes or so. So are we all? I think we're all here. Okay, so you're all very welcome back from the groups. So it'd be great to hear back from a few of you if you wanted to type how you got on with the gratitude journal, or anything else from the home practice during the week. Did you try and live out of liberty, equality, fraternity a bit more? Was there anything that really struck you last week that had an effect on your week? Let me know what you think. Or if you have any questions coming out of last week's material, that would be great to hear too. Okay, I'm not sure if people are typing. Oh, there we go. Great. So Sam is saying uplifting conversation, listening, being kind to oneself, letting the tears come out. That's great. We're saying in our group how talking less and listening with full attention are not the same thing, but that's what mindfulness is about. A great chat. Great. Yeah, the breakout rooms are often the best thing on these courses, I have to say. It's really nice to chat to other people about this stuff. Yeah. I'll give it another one more. Let's see how we're doing. I think what we'll do is we'll push on, but if you're in the middle of writing a comment, it's one of the limitations of Zoom. It's very hard to have an actual conversation like this, but do keep writing if you're in the middle of writing a comment. So in a way, what we talked about in the first week, we're going to be looking at kind of the implications of all this for the rest of the course, but in different areas. And as I said last week, this week I want to look at consumerism. Next week we'll be looking at the area of the environment and so on. And I'm going to launch into a kind of my thoughts and various things I've drawn together from consumerism. In a way, I'm looking at it quite critically. It's not to say that there aren't good things that come out of it, but I want to look at the downsides of it and why I think it's a very damaging system for us, or has huge disadvantages and drawbacks. So let's just let me just share the screen then, just so you have a let's see. Sorry, that's the wrong one. There we go. Okay, where's my pointer gone? There it is. Okay, so one of the big powers in the world, I think, that is quite detrimental to our welfare and the world's welfare is rampant consumerism. So we're in the grip of the very powerful forces of consumerism, I believe. And to say what consumerism is, it's the belief or the idea that your well-being, you being well, you being happy, you having a solid sense of identity, is created by the objects or the life experiences you consume. So the things you get, the objects, or even just what you associate your life with, the kind of experiences you have. Increasingly, for quite a while now, you could almost argue that companies don't sell products anymore; they sell experiences. So it's not just objects as such; it's life experiences. And implied in this heavily, or even explicitly, is that choice makes you happier. That's what we're told. Choice will make us happier, and also there's a price for everything. That you can buy anything. I mean, you've got even some ads saying some things you can't buy, but for everything else, there's this credit card or that credit card. I'm going to try not to mention brands tonight. But even spiritual experiences can probably be commodified, and even spiritual experiences like meditation, the Dharma, can be commodified and bought and sold on the marketplace. So there's a price for everything, and that's one of the things that I really would like to. Excuse the typo there. That I'd really like to try and move away from tonight. And then just right at the outset, does consumerism make us happy? Does consumerism make us happy? One of the things I want to draw out tonight in the first half is that consumerism is very linked with materialism. If we have material things, we will be happier. And there's a book called The High Price of Materialism by a psychologist, Tim Kaser, and he says, strong materialist values are associated with a pervasive undermining of people's well-being, with low life satisfaction and happiness, to depression and anxiety, to physical problems such as anxiety, to personality disorders, narcissism, and antisocial behavior. So he's a man who's made a study of this from a secular point of view, and he just thinks that, as we might expect, it might not be news to you, but strongly materialistic values where you have this view: if you have material things, you'll be happy. Certain material things, you'll be happy. Do not lead to our happiness, actually. And we tend to consume largely because we experience existential boredom, we experience unhappiness, we experience incompleteness. So I don't know about you, but the reason I end up on Amazon or whatever it is, or eBay or those kinds of places, is because there's some kind of lack in myself that I think, if I have something, I'll fill this gap, and we move from thing to thing to thing. And but no matter how much we accumulate, material things cannot make us happy. In fact, to the degree that we identify our happiness with having things, to that degree, I would argue, we will experience boredom and unhappiness. And often then, even if we get those things, we get anxious about those things. So we worry about having our phone stolen, or our nice new car scratched, or our house broken into, or we worry about dropping our computer and breaking the screen, and so we get worried about keeping up the payments on them and so on. So we can never be secure with material things. We'll always fear losing them as well. And the Buddha grew up in a palace, it's said. The story of the Buddha is that he grew up with 3 different palaces, one for each season of the Indian year. And we may or may not have the palace. He left the palace because he realized it wouldn't make him happy. Life there wouldn't make him happy. And we may or may not have a palace. But even if we had a palace, we would probably feel insecure about someone storming the gates of it, or it being sacked by someone else. The other thing about consumerism is that it's often that we often have a sense that consumerism is at the expense of someone else. So if you do any reading at all about phones, electronic products, you can be aware of the terrible suffering that goes on in places like in China, in the huge production cities that they have there. So you might have seen stories of Foxconn, which is who make iPhones, or used to make iPhones anyway. There was a point a few years ago where they were asking their workers to sign pledges not to kill themselves because people were jumping off the roof of the building. The conditions that they were working in was so horrific. And they even put up nets to try and catch the people jumping off the roofs. And there's a lot of conflict minerals involved with a lot of electronics as well, for example. And a lot of our cheap food is processed by people earning very, very little, migrant food workers. And also consumerism, this endless production of things. It's one of the biggest drivers of carbon waste, of carbon footprints and carbon emissions and resource usage, So I'm sure we've seen the pictures of, the seagull's body on the beach full of plastic and things like this. And one of the things that's been interesting this year is just seeing masks everywhere. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't wear masks or anything, but there is a lot of a waste. Going with consumerism is kind of a waste economy as well, where we just create lots and lots of waste and use up lots and lots of the Earth's resources. And the waste economy, the consumerism is promoted and driven so strongly because, well, our very economic system that we live on is dependent upon continually growing our economy. If you're ever working in business, you always have to be increasing your sales in any kind of big business. Businesses have to expand to stay afloat. We have to keep the economy going. And obviously this is really important, keeping the economy going, because economic growth is how governments stay ahead of debt. And if debt builds up and becomes unstable or unpayable, that's when we get huge problems with governments and economic systems. So I just wanted to share a couple of quotes that I thought encapsulate this very well. Again, not from Buddhists, but one is from Charles Handy, who's an Irish author, and he says that economic growth depends ultimately on more and more people wanting more and more of more and more things. Yeah, so there's a lot of more is there. But he says that, to keep this economic growth going, that'll keep our system of economy going, it means more and more people wanting more and more of more and more things. Yeah. And that just seems a bit crazy when you look at it like that. How can we have more and more people? And this is reflected in the next quote, which is from one of the environmental advisors to JFK, Kenneth Boulding. He says, and I'm sure you might have heard this one before, anyone who believes in indefinite growth of anything physical on a physical finite planet is either mad or is an economist. Yeah. So if you believe in infinite growth on a physical planet, you're either mad or you're an economist. Yeah. So I'm not saying that. Sorry. Yeah. So I think those are two quite. They're quite pithy quotes about. The economic system. So the economic system requires growth, basically. And it's an interesting question to ask. Well, what if people were really content? What if people were really content with what you had? And if you were really content with what you had, you wouldn't consume as much. Yeah, you wouldn't consume as much. So a necessary precondition for sustained economic growth is a certain level of discontent. Yeah, we need to be always told that we're not happy as we are. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that governments set out to do that, although maybe they do, I don't know. But certainly the consumer message that we get in every single ad is that if we don't have this thing, we'll be incomplete. And by implication, we'll be unhappy. And this leads us to the next quote, which is that this is by an English economist. He says, the precondition of sustained growth is sustained discontent. So I think that's really stark, that to have economic growth in a consumer model, we need discontent. Yeah, we need discontent. And again, I'm trying to bring in the Dharmic perspective here. I'm not going to unveil myself as a Marxist or anything right now, but I do think there's a truth in that we have to, we are told that we're not happy. That's the basis of consumerism. So our phone is never enough. Our car is never enough. The things that we have are out of date. We need this computer. This computer be this much faster. These clothes are so much more fashionable than the ones last year. All those kinds of messages, all that kind of stimulating of craving, stimulating of envy, stimulating of unhappiness go into this. And I think perhaps one of the best quotes then about consumerism, this will be the last quote for now, is one that you might have heard of before, which says that consumerism is about people, us people, being persuaded to spend money we don't have on things we don't need to create impressions that don't last on people that we don't care about. Yeah. So we're being persuaded to spend money we don't have. So huge amounts of debt building up by spending money we don't have on things we don't really need at the end of the day, to create impressions that don't last. How long do impressions last upon people if that's why you're buying them? And those impressions are on people that we don't even care about anyway in the long term, most of the time. So in a way, consumerism is kind of taking us for a mug, actually, in some ways. And what's more, all of our things that we buy, our cars, our phones, our washing machines, they even have a certain built-inness to break, basically, or to run out and not last. So there was a BBC series back in 2014 called "The Men Who Make Us Spend," and it gives the example of, in the 1920s, there was a cartel of light bulb manufacturers, and it was easy to make light bulbs last for 2,500 hours, but they decided to make them last instead only for 1,000 hours. Yeah. So when you only make them last for 1,000 hours at pretty much the same price, well, people have to buy 2.5 times as many bulbs then, don't they? And as a result, then you make 2.5 times more income, basically. So they call this planned obsolescence, and you get this all over the place. I have a printer behind me, you can't quite see, it's behind my chair, that there's a chip in the toner cartridge, so when it gets to a certain level, it will not let me print anything more, even though there's still a good bit of ink in it. It just makes me go and buy a new cartridge. If I'd known that, I wouldn't have got that printer, but there you go. So printing, it's a classic example of printers, and printers are where most companies make money. If you ever wonder why printers are so cheap, it's because it's the cartridges that make companies the money. So another kind of example of things running out too quickly. Or if you're a football or rugby supporter, or if your kids are rugby or football supporters, you'll know the stress of having to buy, if you're really into it, having to buy a new jersey every year. So again, just kind of, planned obsolescence, you could say. And then the last part of my rant about consumerism, and then I'll stop, I promise, is that a second last area is that things aren't repairable anymore. So when was the last time you had a phone that you could replace the battery on? The battery, I think, is probably the biggest part of the phone that really makes people buy a new phone, is the battery going. And as the battery goes down, the phone slows down as well, usually. So there's all those kinds of things. When have you repaired your radio or your white plastic good or your kettle or whatever it is? So they're not designed to be repairable anymore. So we end up with products we don't really need in an attempt to keep us happy. Yeah. The last area I'll mention is, as well, I'll come back to this a bit more next week, but is food production. So much research has gone into developing food which stimulates more desire and craving, not just psychologically, but neurologically as well, especially sugary food. So we end up eating more and more foods that's cheaper to produce because it's got fructose syrup and things like that that have no nutritional value, that make us much more compulsive. I'm sure many of you have seen the movie Super Size Me. I can really recommend it as a kind of slightly horrific and fascinating documentary where the documentary maker, I think his name is Morgan Spurlock, decides to just live off McDonald's for a month. And every time they offer to supersize it, he has to say yes. And after a few weeks of it, there's a 7-minute summary on YouTube that you can watch. And his girlfriend is a like a brilliant vegan chef as well. I wouldn't mind, and she has to watch him do this. And over the course of the next couple of weeks, he just destroys his body, and he gets crazy headaches. The only thing he gets these mad headaches that can only be alleviated by eating more fast food, and he's consuming something like a pound of sugar every day. He loses all his libido. He feels depressed. And eventually he has to start because he wakes up in the middle of the night with severe heart palpitations and he gets worried he's going to die. You know, so I think it's a great example of the kind of. I mean, it's obviously an extreme example of consumerism at work in the in the food sector, and also the food sector is a huge production again of problems for the environment. So I really do think that we need to look at consumerism. I hope I'm not being too gloom and doom. We'll come back to the Dharmic response, which I think is really inspiring actually to all this in a minute, or in a few minutes. But I just one last area I wanted to explore, and then we'll do a reflection and go into groups. Is well, where did consumerism arise from? And obviously, this is hugely complex. And I'm not an economist, so I don't know all the ins and outs of it. But I think one of the things I did want to draw out is that what I said about materialism and nihilism again, and I think a large factor in the growth of modern day consumerism was it developed over the last couple of hundred years, particularly since the European Enlightenment and since Nietzsche's famous saying of God being dead. So in 1882, Nietzsche said famously, "God is dead." And I think what he meant was that having this idea of God as a linchpin to our ethical systems, as our system of values based around Christianity in the same way where the whole of society was fundamentally ordered around that, was over. That era was over at that point. And we couldn't organize society according to those morals and values anymore. And that would take a while to play out, obviously. And he was very worried about this. It wasn't that this was a triumphant call necessarily from Nietzsche, because he feared that it would lead to a sinking into a nihilism and a rejection of all kinds of value and meaning. And he also worried that the majority of people didn't really realize this great turning that was going on because of fear and angst. And I think this he was worried that it would lead to nihilism, basically. Nihilism, you could say, is this belief that nothing really matters ultimately. Our actions don't really matter ultimately. And consumerism is an immediate outcome of nihilism. So if you believe that nothing really matters fundamentally at a deeper level, well, all you're going to do then is look for pleasure. You might as well just have a bit of pleasure while the boat sinks. Okay? And consumerism, you could say, is this par excellence. It's the rejection of higher values. It's the belief that if we just have this thing, we'll be happy. It's the rejection of anything of higher spiritual value or moral value, and in a way, I think consumerism is the dominant religion of our times, actually. I know a lot of people still say that they're Christian. A lot of people say they're Buddhist, various religions, humanist. But I do think when you look at people's actions in the world, consumerism is the dominant religion of our times. You only have to look at this in yourself. I'm an ordained Buddhist. And sometimes when I'm unhappy, I turn to meditation, I turn to friendship, I turn to generosity and so on. And then sometimes when I'm unhappy, I turn to Amazon and I turn to craving for a new phone, or I turn to wishing I won the lottery and so on. So to the degree that I'm turning towards those things for deeper happiness, to that degree, I'm practicing consumerism as a religion, you could say. I'm being quite pokey here now. And our actions speak louder than our words. So again, we might say that we have deep and meaningful spiritual values, but you have to look at your actions as well. And I think we're very deeply influenced by consumerism. It's the new God, it's the new religion. And I don't say this for us to give ourselves a hard time. I think it's the water that we swim in, it's the air that we breathe these days. I don't think we realize just how all pervasive it is. But I think it is a real problem. And I think it causes us a lot of unhappiness, actually. And nihilism, consumerism, tends to be very self-referential. It tends to be very narcissistic. We put ourselves at the center of everything when we get into that mentality, and it kind of treats us like a mug. It treats us like a fool as well. It's saying, here you go, have this little thing and you'll be happy. So for me, I like to ask myself the question, do I really want to be treated like a mug like that? Do I really want to buy into the story that Coca-Cola, that Apple, that Google, that all the consumer companies that are out there making money off me are telling me that I'll just be happy with this? Or do I want to be much more inspired and aroused to try and live a life of greater meaning? And we will explore that life of greater meaning in the second half. So the first half is kind of, I can see Jyotika looking despairing there, but we'll be exploring that. That's the diagnosis, you could say, at least from my perspective. You're free to disagree or agree. And in the second half, we'll look at the positive vision of how we can respond to that. And Jyotika is saying, stop turning to Amazon and look at local stuff. Worship at the altar of consumerism in Ireland. Yeah, that's true. That would be better. But best would be to practice the Dharma. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to just do a short reflection for maybe 5 minutes, just to draw out some of the points, because I think we can hear about it. It's good to reflect upon it, and then it's good to talk about it. So we'll do a little reflection for about 7 minutes, and then we'll go back into groups for another 10 minutes, and then we'll have a tea break. So why don't we just get comfortable again? Closing your eyes when you're ready, or if it's easier to reflect with your eyes open, just having your eyes softly open with a soft gaze, but you can have them closed as well. And whenever we do reflection in Buddhism, we always try and do it in our bodies. Reflection is as much a matter of the heart, of the guts, even of the bowels, than the head. So we reflect down in our emotions, down in our body. So you could put your hand on your belly if you want. That can be a nice thing to do in reflection, and just breathe into your hand. And I want you to recollect then, when you're ready, bring yourself back into your memory of, or your recollection of, the last time you were in the grip of something, last time you were in the grip of really desiring something, a material thing, to make yourself feel better. I'm not talking about, an honest hunger for food when you're hungry, or being actually thirsty or something like that. More like the kind of things I was talking about, where you said to yourself, if only I had this thing, I'd be happy. It could be a gadget. It could be food in the sense of pleasure eating, comfort eating. Or it could even be just wanting to be seen a certain way, having a certain status, being regarded in a certain way, getting a certain job, getting money. If only I had this thing, I'd be happy. And staying with that feeling, regardless of whether you actually got it or not, later on. So how did it feel to be in the grip of this? Was it pleasant? Was it painful? Was it neutral? Did you get the object you wanted? And if you didn't, how did you respond? And if you did get it, did it meet the need you were feeling? And how do you feel about that thing now? How do you feel about that object now, having got it? Did it meet that story you were telling yourself? And if we're being honest, what did we really want with that thing? What were we really looking for? And what would it be like to be free of that kind of story? To be free of wanting things in that way? To not need that object in that kind of graspy, clingy kind of way? What would it be like? And then when you're ready, taking a deeper breath or two into your belly again, taking in sounds around us, broadening out our awareness, noticing how we're feeling, and in your own time, reintroducing movement and opening your eyes. Okay, so I've spoken for quite a while, so I want to stop talking now and let you guys have a chance to talk. So why don't we go back into rooms, into groups? So why don't we go back in for, let's see, why don't we go in for about 9 minutes? 9 minutes, Aim? Oh, well, let's just leave it at 10 minutes, and let's see if you guys have any responses to what we talked about tonight. Anything about the reflection? Anything you want to share? And do make sure in each group that everyone has a chance to speak. Just keep an eye on the time. And we'll see you back here in 10 minutes, and then we'll just adjourn again briefly, and then we'll have a tea break or a leg stretch or whatever. So Amy, I can't see you, but if you're happy to send people into the groups, that would be great. Okay, welcome back. I think we're all back. We lost a couple of people there. It looked like their internet connection went. So I think in two of the rooms, one person dropped out, just in case you're wondering. Okay, so in a moment we'll have a break. Why don't we have a break for 10 minutes at 10 in a minute or two? So, but if you have time, it'd be great if you wanted to, during the break, put any comments or thoughts into the chat box. I'd be particularly curious if anyone did the gratitude journal and found it of use, and also anything you wanted to share from that discussion that you had there. And then finally, before we break, just to remind you that maybe Amy, you could put the links in if you have them to hand. All our online events, you can go to dublinbuddhistcentre.org/online, and to donate, dublinbuddhistcentre.org/donate. So the course is being done on a donation basis. So if you want to help us by supporting, so we're moving away from a consumer mentality where you pay money and you get a product you consume, but rather we're giving to you, you're giving to us. It's a kind of a mutual generosity, and that's a better way that we try and operate on in our Buddhist Centre. So mutual giving, mutual generosity, and you can give as much or as little as you want, but the more you give, the more you support us, and the more stuff like this we can do. So do think about giving if you can. And you can click on the link and leave it in the background and do it after the course. And don't forget to type in as well. Great, thanks for that comment already, Sam. We ended on a note that mindfulness is a great tool to recognize when we're in the throes of consumerism and materialism. That's a really good point, yeah. So we'll look a bit more at the positives after the tea break, after the leg stretch. So let's be back here, and you can comment in the meantime. Let's be back ready to go. I'm going to start talking at 20 past 8 so be back for 20 past 8. We'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, so just to respond to a few comments. So one person was asking about how to find out more about Dr. Ambedkar, who I mentioned last week. So I'll send a link or two out in the notes. So I won't put that here. So I'll send it out tomorrow morning with the video. Yeah. Louise recommends Fairphone. Yeah, I've come across Fairphone, which is a very, very ethically sourced phone, because we do need phones. You know what I mean? I'm not saying you can do it out of phone, so you might want to check that out. It's meticulous in terms of how it's built and how it's resourced and everything. A few people said that they've been really appreciating. Noel and Julianne said they really appreciated the gratitude journal. So if you haven't been doing that, I'd really recommend doing it, because it is very, very powerfully transformative, particularly if you're of a cynical nature or if you get a bit down or whatever. It does really focus on the positive. And Kerry is saying, well, maybe if we stopped doing consumerism and felt okay, wouldn't that be the end of suffering? Well, Kerry, that is true. That is Buddhism. Yeah, Buddhism can teach us this, hopefully. Okay, so there's a bit to get through. So I'm gonna go into the Dharmic half, you could say. I mean, it's not that we haven't had Dharma so far, but I wanted to talk more explicitly about what the Buddha said, and then we'll do hopefully have time for another little reflection and the home practice and some groups again, yeah? So the Buddhist diagnosis of, let me just check. Yeah, the Buddhist diagnosis of craving. Let me just bring up the thing again. So the Buddha didn't live in a consumer society like we do. It was a very different time. But he did recognize the problems of craving, and he talked about this thing called dukkha. So the word dukkha, it's a Sanskrit word, which is like the Buddhist Latin, you could say. And it translates, perhaps the most immediate one is dissatisfaction, but it can also translate as unhappiness. It can translate as suffering. And it literally means that there's a wheel out of kilter. So one of your wheels in your ox cart is slightly out of sync with the rest, and everything just is uncomfortable as you go along. You know, there's something wrong. There's something not quite right about your experience. And there's different levels at which the Buddha talked about this. So there's the dukkha, there's the unhappiness, dissatisfaction, suffering of the physical level, where maybe you stub your toe off a door, you get a bruise or something like that. You physically hurt yourself or get hurt. That's one level of it, the first level. The second level is a more psychological level, where we're either brought together with what we don't want. So you're stuck with a person you really dislike in your flat, in your house during lockdown or something like that, and you can't get away from them, or at work. Or else you're separated from what you want. So you're madly in love with someone, but you can't get to see them because you're in lockdown or something like that. Or maybe they love someone else, the wretches, yeah? Or maybe it's psychological in the sense that you're worried about losing something that you have, and then there's also the existential level of dukkha. So might be like where your life's pretty good, actually. It's a lovely day, there's a blue sky, you have money, you have a nice phone, you have a nice car, you've people who like you have status, and at the same time there's always something that isn't being met in you. There's something still not quite there. You still long for something more, and you can't even identify what that is. And even if it's just a kind of a deeper sense of meaning in your life, despite all the things that are good, or even a sense of just boredom, existential boredom. So for me, when I came across Buddhism, it wasn't that I was really suffering or anything, but I just felt there was a lack of deeper meaning in my life, and that's what brought me to it. So that's what you might call existential dukkha, existential dissatisfaction, even existential boredom. And our response then is that when we experience dukkha, the Buddha said, we will tend to respond with craving. We will tend to look for things to fill that existential gap, look for things to distract us from that dukkha, from that dissatisfaction. In a way, it's not really rocket science, is it? But it's useful. The Buddha just talked about this again and again and again because, yes, we can know it intellectually, but it's something that we keep doing again and again. So because we're fundamentally lazy, well, I'm certainly fundamentally lazy. I'm gonna, you can decide that yourself if you are too. We'll tend to take the path of least resistance, which is to crave for things, to fill that, or to distract us from that dukkha. Yeah, or at least that's how we think it is. Yeah. So we will tend to. So you could say that craving is the tendency of the unenlightened mind to long for, to want, or to cling to things. Yeah, we want something pleasant. We want, or conversely, we might want something unpleasant to be away from us. That's craving. You could that craving for that thing to be gone, and that turns into hatred very quickly as well. And we think as well that if we have this thing, we'll be happy. That's central to the story of craving. If we have this thing, we'll be happy. And it might be a thing. It might be, a house, a car, money. It might be a person that's dear to us. It might be a memory. It might be an idea. It might be a set of religious beliefs, political beliefs, notions about ourselves. It might be status. There's so many things that we can crave. Yeah. And the thing, so there's lots and lots of different things that we can crave that could give us pleasure. But I think most of our craving is probably at a deeper level, probably for security, actually. And we do things to try and make us feel more solid and secure. The big thing about craving, the big problem with craving, is that it tends to really distort our sense of things. It really tends to distort how we interpret things, particularly how we interpret and the stories we tell ourselves about that thing that we're craving. Yeah. So we really, really crave a glass of wine. We really, really crave alcohol because we're under such pressure, and a glass of wine will ease everything. It'll make it better. We can relax. We won't have to worry about things. And maybe that's true of a half a glass of wine or a glass of wine. But usually it's hard to stop there. We always have a bit more. Or even with that, we when we're craving this thing, we're focusing only on the pleasure it can give us, and we're ignoring the pain of the hangover the next day. So the craving distorts our interpretation, and that tends to make us focus only on the pleasure something gives us, not on the displeasure. So we would deeply want the objects of our love, to love us back, or the people, and then we ignore all the parts of them that we find annoying, and maybe that's necessary for romance to take place. So we ignore the unpleasant aspects, but we also exaggerate the pleasant aspects of it. We totally exaggerate what it's going to give to us and totally overrate it. Yeah. So that's something that we do as well with craving, and we also think that we distort our interpretation because we think that we can make this thing part of us to build up our security in the face of the winds of life, the winds of the world. Ultimately, nothing is secure from the Buddhist point of view, in the world at least. What is secure is practicing the Dharma, practicing the Buddhist teachings. That will lead to a more existential security. But things in and of themselves can't bring us lasting security. But when we're craving something, we ignore that story and we think, if only we have this thing, we will be secure. And of course, then consumerism preys upon this. This is a perfect fit. In a way, it's not that there's consumerism and there's craving and there's a perfect fit. Consumerism arises because it taps into this. That's what consumerism plays upon. It activates craving, as I said earlier. It tells us that we won't be happy until we have this thing. And it's a vicious cycle then, where we lose sense of what's really important. So we become more concerned with the car that we drive in than the journey we're taking. We're more concerned with the phone that we're talking on than the quality of the communication we're having on the phone. So and as a result, we feel worse, and that feeds back into the cycle of, oh, well, maybe it's not worked. Maybe I just need a better phone, and so on. Sorry to be focusing so much on electronic gadgets, but they're a particular penchant of mine to be craving gadgets. I'm sure you have your own products you crave for as well. So the Buddha, before he was enlightened, as I mentioned earlier, lived in a palace, but he felt like he had to leave the palace. So what I want to talk about for the rest of the evening is this whole thing of leaving the palace and living a more simple life. So we really want to leave the palace. And the palace, we could ask ourselves, are we happy to leave the palace? The palace might feel like, well, it's quite enjoyable being in the palace, whatever the palace is for you, or we like the security it brings to us. But the palace is impermanent as well. The palace is built upon illusory foundations. And not just it's built upon illusory foundations, but the palace is actually a prison, if we can see that clearly enough from a Buddhist perspective. So I want to talk really positively then for the rest of the evening about what we can do to leave the palace, kind of antidotes to craving. So these are a few things from the Buddhist tradition. So the first one is we can practice living more simply. Yeah. So if you look at the Buddha's life, the Buddha left the palace and after a few years of wandering became enlightened. And he then didn't go back to the palace after that, after he'd completed his quest, after he experienced the unending happiness of enlightenment, the unending bliss of enlightenment. He would have been happy wherever he was. But actually what he set up was a community of people. I'll just stop the sharing because he set up a community of people, of monks and nuns, of men and women, who lived really, really simply, who went forth, is how the phrase went. They went forth from their everyday lives, and they lived with very few possessions. So they lived with a few sets of robes. You're able to have a bowl for your begging food to be put into, and you go around begging your food. You'd live with a water strainer for obvious reasons. You'd have some medicine, and usually medicine back then was like usually concocted from cow's urine and things like that. They were firm believers in the efficacy of medicine like that. So they would live very, very, very simple lives and live radically free. And if you read, it wasn't an easy life, I'd imagine, but if you read the poetry of those monks and nuns, so many of them just sing of the joy of freedom, the freedom of a simple life, and not feeling like your possessions you have to carry your possessions everywhere. I remember when I was a student, I got into, as I'm sure many of you did if you're the same age as me, but accumulating musical CDs and what your musical collection said about you on your shelf. And the other thing about being a student is you tend to move house a lot. So you end up lugging these CDs around you from house to house to house, and eventually they were breaking, they were scratching, they were disappearing, and I just gave them away basically. I mean, to confess, I digitalized them and then gave them away. So I don't know how much I really gave them up, but it was such a sense of freedom then from having to lug these things around. And our possessions tend to own us if we're not very careful. It's not that we own them. So we need to learn how to live a simple life. And I mean this really, really positively. So sometimes when I hear, sometimes when I think about the environmental problems that we face and how we're all going to have to live simple lives, and we can feel such guilt at how much we consume. The image that comes to me is that we have to, if we're going to live simply, that means living in a cave somewhere with no electricity and no running water, living off half-cooked potatoes and things like this. So that's not the vision of simplicity I want to communicate. I want to communicate a really positive vision of simplicity. And it's this simplicity from a Buddhist perspective isn't so much a self-denial, but more of a getting out of the way of what's not important. So what's truly important can shine through. So simplicity is getting things out of the way that aren't really that important. So what's truly important can shine through. And we might not always experience it that way, because the first thing we'll do when we try and live simply and with fewer needs is we'll probably feel bored actually, and want more stimulation. A really simple way of living simply is just is just getting off all social media for the week, for example. Our lives would be a lot simpler if we were off social media, if you're a social media user. But boredom is something out of which a deeper sense of joy and beauty can emerge. And there's a freedom that comes from living simply. There's a liberation that comes from living simply. It frees up our time. It frees up our energy. It frees up our resources. It frees up our sense of appreciation of beauty as well. One of my favorite quotes from Sangharakshita, who's the man who set up our Buddhist community, he talks about the aesthetic simplicity, the beauty of simplicity. And he says, "The truly simple life glows with significance, for its simplicity is not the dead simplicity of a skeleton, but the living simplicity of a flower or a great work of art." So I'll read that again. The truly simple life glows with significance, for its simplicity is not the dead simplicity of a skeleton, but the living simplicity of a flower or a great work of art. So this is the kind of life that the Buddha led. This is the kind of life that Buddhism offers us. The living beauty, the simplicity of a flower and its beauty, the simplicity of a great work of art, rather than the simplicity of denial and of death. The skeleton has been used there. So it's the simplicity of beauty. It's the simplicity of simple friendship, of connection, of meaning. And Buddhism offers tools to experience this simplicity. Meditation, an ethical life, living wisely. And if we can do this, we'll experience simplicity not as a kind of a neutering of our lives, but as an enriching of our lives. So really try and, one part of your homework in a few minutes is to live simply this week, and not watch out for the stories that you're telling yourselves of denial and you need this thing, but actually just try and live simply. And I think living simply and living with awareness, someone mentioned how in one of the groups earlier, mindfulness is a great antidote to this mindless consumerism. So living simply and living with awareness is a radical act in these days, in this age. Yeah, it's a radical subversive act to live simply. So if you want to be subversive, live simply. Yeah. So that's the first one of the Buddha's approach. So and living more simply, and in particular appreciating the beauty of simplicity. So the next one then is to live with more contentment. So contentment begins, like the Buddha and his followers, with going forth, with renouncing, with letting go of craving. And in a way, contentment begins with a feeling of just being tired of the same old craving all the time, being tired of being on the sugary merry-go-round of consumerism. We long for something more, and that's where contentment comes from, feeling like we're growing out of our old tendencies of craving. So ideally, contentment comes from a growing out of craving, letting go of. The image that Sangharakshita uses is it's like a child letting go of their toys and not being interested in them anymore. So we want to grow up when it comes to consumerism. We don't need these things anymore to boost our ego. We can feel contentment in and of themselves. And with contentment comes endless possibilities for creativity and growth and happiness and connection. So the other thing about contentment is that, we will really appreciate things. We will really appreciate. We'll still have to use a phone, for example. We'll still need a computer. We'll still need technology. We'll probably still need a car if we have to travel any distance. But we can really appreciate them, and we can relate to things much more in a much more healthy way, without exaggerating their stories, how brilliant they are or how awful they are, and just see them as they really are. Yeah, there's a lot more that could be said there, but I'll leave it at that for now. Trying to live with greater contentment and the joy of again, like with simplicity, living with the joy of contentment. And then the third one then is there's four of these, is living in terms of generosity. So I think generosity is a really radical and subversive act in the modern world as well, in the consumer world. So generosity means giving of ourselves. So there's so much that we can give. And generosity means seeing things in terms of what we can give rather than what we can get. So it's a radical act, seeing things in terms of what we can give instead of what we can merely get. Yeah. And if you're operating as a consumer, you're really focusing on what you can get. That's how you're working. So in Buddhism talks about lots of different things you can give, and generosity is a really core and very, very highly valued quality in Buddhism. And it's said that you can give, obviously you can give money, you can give things, but actually giving of money and things is the lowest level of generosity, even though it's still very, very important. We can give of ourselves, we can give our attention, we can give our time, we can give our energy, we can give our possessions, we can give life and limb, and we can even give fearlessness, we can give culture, we can even give the Dharma, which is in Buddhism the highest thing we can give. We can give people meaning. I was asking earlier if we want to give money to support the center. In a way, by giving money to support the center, you're giving people the gift of the Dharma as well, because we can give people the Dharma, which is the Buddhist teachings, which is in a way the highest meaning. I'm a Buddhist because I think the Buddha's teachings are the highest thing that one can live by. So generosity really means living out of an inner abundance. So when one has an inner abundance, one is naturally generous. And when one practices generosity more and more, one experiences an inner abundance. And many, there's Buddhist figures, Buddha figures who are, you see in pictures, who are embodiments of this inner abundance, this inner wealth. So when we have a rich inner experience, we will naturally allow that to flow out into the world. And the more we give, the more we get. Yeah. So I think generosity is a hugely inspiring area, and it leads to great happiness. Great happiness. And sometimes, we might not be able to meditate. Sometimes we might not be in great states of mind. We might feel very grumpy. We might not be sure how we can practice the Dharma, but we can always give, even if it's just taking someone in a little bit more. And the Buddha said then, in terms of the happiness of the spiritual path, the happiness of a generous life, the happy of a meaningful life, he said, he was talking here about his community of followers. He said, "Happy indeed we live, content among the greedy. Among men who are greedy, we dwell free from greed. Happy indeed we live, we for whom there are no possessions. Feeders on rapture shall we be, like the gods of brilliant light." So happy indeed we live. And then the last thing, and I'll stop then after this and we'll do a reflection, is the fourth thing then that I think we need. Let me just go back to the thing. Antidotes to craving, but really how to live a happy life is having a sense of value and sacredness. And I'm putting value and sacredness with capital letters just to really emphasize them. So having a sense of something that's sacred, having a sense of value. So you remember I mentioned earlier that one of the besetting sins of consumerism is that it tries to put a price on everything. So if we can try and have something in our lives that we can't commodify, that can't be bought or sold, that we don't, that even to put a value on it feels utterly wrong. That's what I'm talking about here. So I've said earlier that in a way, companies don't sell products anymore. They sell something of this ilk. Coca-Cola sells happiness and meaning, you could say. Although really what it's selling is just a mixture of carbonated water, high fructose corn syrup, caramel color, phosphoric acid, natural flavorings, and caffeine. Basically, that's what it's selling. Sugary water. But it tries to sell a lot more because we have an innate need for value and sacredness. That's what it's trying to tap into. And I don't have loads of time now to talk about it, but because we're running out of time. But we need to have something that we would be utterly adverse to pricing, utterly adverse to selling, utterly adverse to trying to put a price on. So what is it in your life that you would absolutely hate to have to put a price on, to commodify? For me, I think in terms of Dharma practice, what this could be is a sense of an ethical life, a life where we live on the basis of kindness, generosity, empathy, concern, awareness, wisdom, and so on. and recognizing that there's skillful actions that will lead us to greater meaning and depth. And we can live, that we live in a universe where if we live in really in tune with the Dharma, it's almost like the universe will respond to that. And the universe isn't just dead matter, it's a universe that's alive with potential and connection and richness. And that is how the Buddha experienced the universe. In a way, us seeing the universe as dead is probably a really wrong picture. Well, the Buddha said that quite explicitly, that that's not how the universe is. So we need something sacred in our lives, something that we could stand up for, something even perhaps, if to be a bit dramatic, that we'd be willing to sacrifice ourselves for on the everyday level, or even, die for, you could say. What would that be for us? What would that, in particular, what would a Buddhist perspective be? Okay, so there's more I could say on that, and there's more in the notes this week if you want to read the notes. Maybe what we could do now is, let's see, what do we do now? Yeah, I don't think we have time quite for a reflection and for groups, and I think it would be better to go into groups again, just because you've been listening to me for quite a while. Maybe I'll just give the home practice this week, and then we'll go into the groups and you can talk about it. So let me just share one last page then. So the home practice this week. So read the notes. Pay attention to your habits of consumption. So that might be a strange way of putting it, but what are your habits of consumption this week? What are you trying to get from the thing that you're wanting? Will it work? Has it worked in the past? What's the story you're telling yourself? Is there something positive I can do yourself? Yeah, so that's just what I've put there. Don't worry about that text. And then, can you live more simply, more generously, more contentedly this week? Can you live from a sense of true value, of sacredness, and so on? All those 4 things that I talked about there. And I'd really encourage you as well then to keep your gratitude journal going as well this week. So really watch out for your patterns of consumption, and can you live from the more of a Dharmic perspective in terms of simplicity, contentment, generosity, and value or sacredness, and so on. Yep. And keep your gratitude journal going. So why don't we go into the groups? Maybe I'll just share, sorry, if you just give me 1 second, I'll share some of that in the chat so that you can see it in the groups as well. So there's the 4, it's not very clear there, but at least you can read it a little bit. Sorry, Ash. If I was more prepared, I could have had that ready for you. And then the home practice this week. So Amy, you'll need to put us in the groups in a minute. So why don't we go back into the groups, and we will go into the groups for maybe about 8 minutes or so. So maybe just one thing that struck you from the second half that you really want to take on, and anything about what you need to do to make sure you do the homework. How's about that? One thing that struck you from the second half, and what you're going to do about the homework for the next week. So Amy, you can pop us in the groups whenever you're ready. Yeah, I think we're all back now. Okay, so that's pretty much the evening. You've plenty of homework to do now. You've plenty of, hopefully, a lot to think about. You might even have a lot to disagree with, who knows. Quite happy to be disagreed with. And I'll email you in the morning with the video of the course and the notes and the home practice. And don't forget as well, I think I mentioned this earlier, you might want to keep on your gratitude journal as well during the week, or start it if you haven't started it. I think, again, I just really encourage people to be be subversive. There's a lot that's wrong with consumer society, and I think practicing the Dharma, practicing appreciation, practicing generosity, practicing contentment, having a sense of the sacred is in these days is a subversive act. So be subversive, and lovely to be in the group with you all. So that's it. Feel free to leave. You can also unmute yourself if you want to say goodbye to people.